The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has approved over $100 billion in funding for developing countries since its inception. This institution, with a membership of almost every country in the world, plays a significant role on the global stage. Its mission? To ensure the stability of the international monetary system and facilitate global growth. The IMF is frequently referred to as a financial firefighter, stepping in when countries are in economic distress, providing loans, policy advice, and technical assistance. For developing nations, the IMF's support can often be perceived as a lifeline, striving to stabilize economies, foster sustainable growth, and reduce poverty. Its influence extends far beyond dollars and cents, shaping policies, economies, and ultimately lives. And yet, the IMF is often shrouded in controversy and misunderstanding. Criticisms and controversies abound over the IMF's role in developing countries. Many critics argue that the strict conditions attached to its loans can lead to economic hardship for the poorest sectors of society. Others point out that the debt incurred by these loans often leaves countries worse off, and that the economic austerity measures imposed can stifle growth and exacerbate poverty. There have also been concerns about the IMF's governance, with critics pointing out a lack of transparency and accountability. Furthermore, there is a significant debate about the influence of powerful countries in IMF decision-making, leading to the perception that policies may not always be in the best interest of the developing nations it purports to help. So what do we really know about the IMF's influence on these developing nations? The full complexity of its impact is a topic of immense debate. While many argue that the IMF serves only the interests of wealthy developed nations, there is counter-evidence suggesting a different narrative. The IMF does engage with developing nations, allocating a significant portion of its resources and support to these regions. However, critics express that these efforts might be skewed towards the interests of the rich. The IMF's initiatives aim at enhancing economic stability and growth, especially in areas facing economic challenges. Yet, detractors argue that the policies it promotes often favor rich nations, indirectly leading to economic hardships in the developing world. For instance, the IMF has been accused of promoting stringent austerity programs in low-income countries, potentially deepening their economic woes rather than alleviating them. While they do offer financial assistance, policy advice, and technical aid designed to bolster the economic frameworks of developing nations, skeptics question whether these programs truly benefit these countries in the long term. They argue that the IMF's high-interest loans can trap these nations in a cycle of debt, ultimately working against their economic prosperity. Even in times of crisis, when the IMF provides financial aid and policy guidance, critics suggest this support often comes with conditions that might further the interests of richer nations. They claim that these policies often lead to structural adjustments that favor foreign investors over local economies, hindering recovery and sustainable growth. While the IMF undeniably plays a role in developing nations, it is a matter of debate whether this role is exclusive to the rich or equally beneficial to all. This demonstrates the need for a more nuanced understanding of the IMF's functions and impacts. While some argue that the IMF's policies are beneficial to developing countries, there are critics who suggest that these policies can sometimes have negative impacts. Let's delve into this perspective. Critics assert that the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF, while not directly imposing policies, their policy recommendations can lead to unfavorable outcomes. These recommendations are based on comprehensive economic analysis and the experiences of its 189 member countries. However, when the IMF collaborates with a country to craft a policy program, it may not always align with the specific needs and circumstances of that country. Critics also contend that the IMF's advice often leans towards austerity measures, which can put a strain on the social spending of a country. They may suggest ways to increase revenue or adjust spending. However, these measures might lead to cuts in essential social programs. In spite of these criticisms, it is important to mention that there are several examples of developing countries that have positively transformed their economies with the help of the IMF. South Korea, for instance, transitioned from a low-income country in the 1960s to a high-income country today, largely owing to the policy advice and financial support from the IMF. Similarly, Uganda in the early 1990s was grappling with hyperinflation, a large black market, and widespread poverty. With IMF support, the country implemented economic reforms that led to 2 decades of strong economic growth and a significant reduction in poverty. So while there are criticisms, it's clear that the IMF's policies have also played a significant role in bolstering developing economies. Despite its many initiatives, the International Monetary Fund has faced criticism suggesting that it sometimes overlooks the social impact of policies on developing countries. This argument, like many others, warrants closer examination. While it is clear that the IMF places a significant emphasis on social spending in its programs, critics argue that these efforts may not always reach the most vulnerable segments of society. The IMF realizes that for economic policies to be sustainable, they must be socially responsible and inclusive. Though in some instances, their support for social safety nets has been called into question. These programs, designed to provide assistance to the most vulnerable segments of society, are a key component of many IMF-supported initiatives. However, critics argue that these safety nets are sometimes insufficient, especially during times of economic hardship. Furthermore, while the IMF has played a significant role in promoting social welfare in developing countries, questions arise about the consistency of their impacts. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, despite the IMF's recommendations to expand access to education and healthcare, some critics argue that these efforts have not always translated into improved conditions on the ground. In Latin America, despite the IMF's work with governments to establish social welfare programs that target poverty and inequality, critics suggest these programs have not always been as successful as hoped. Critics argue that while these initiatives have helped to lift many people out of poverty, they sometimes fall short of making a substantial difference, raising questions about the IMF's commitment to social progress. The IMF also supports initiatives that promote gender equality and environmental sustainability. However, critics point out that these issues are often complex and multifaceted, and economic policies alone may not adequately address. Thus, while it's clear that the IMF certainly doesn't ignore the social impact of its policies entirely, critics argue that it needs to do more to ensure that social factors are effectively integrated into their approach to achieving economic stability and growth. In reality, the IMF faces an ongoing debate about the social implications of its initiatives. In the face of myths and misconceptions, it is crucial to comprehend the authentic function of the IMF's role in developing countries. Today, let's embark on to debunk myths and misconceptions about the International Monetary Fund and its role in the economic landscape of developing nations. We began by addressing the myth that the IMF is solely for affluent countries, a baseless idea indeed. The primary objective of the IMF is to maintain the stability of the international monetary system by offering financial help and policy advice to member countries experiencing economic difficulties, irrespective of their economic standing. We then countered the assertion that the IMF enforces detrimental policies on developing countries, revealing that this is far from the truth. The IMF in reality works in tandem with these nations to create economic programs that are tailored to their specific needs. It's not about policy imposition, but about providing a comprehensive plan for economic stability and growth. We then addressed the misunderstanding that the IMF disregards the societal impacts of its programs. We discovered the IMF's deep concern about the social repercussions of its policies. It actively encourages social spending and is committed to safeguarding the most susceptible sectors of society during economic adjustments. By dispelling these myths, we've brought to light the IMF's dedication to promoting economic stability and growth in developing countries. However, it is important to acknowledge that the IMF's role and practices have been subject to criticisms and controversies. There have been instances where its policies have faced backlash for exacerbating economic troubles rather than alleviating them. Yet, it is equally important to recognize the IMF's genuine efforts to learn from past experiences, improve, and adapt its practices. The IMF isn't an opponent but a partner, assisting countries in navigating through the often turbulent waters of economic difficulties. The IMF provides support, advice, and resources, aiding these nations in their pursuit of economic prosperity. The role of the IMF is to foster an environment conducive to economic success, where nations can stand strong and the global economy can sustain its stability. It's not about dominance or imposition, but about cooperation and mutual growth. So let's set the myths aside and embrace the realities. Despite the criticisms, the IMF, far from being a villain, is a key ally for developing nations in their journey towards economic prosperity.